On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, what happened on board the motor vessel Ever Given? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So, waiting 2.5 years, that's right, 2.5 years, to release their report on the grounding of the motor vessel Ever Given in the Suez on March 23rd, 2021. For those of you who don't know, this channel started because of that. My very first video was myself and John Conrad of G Captain talking about the grounding of the vessel, and we've gone from a tiny little YouTube channel with 136 subscribers to over 117,000 subscribers today. So we've been waiting 2.5 years for this report. And obviously, 2.5 years, there's a lot to write about. And of course, Panama has been extensive. They've gone through thorough research and have produced a report. This is not the report. This is my Apple iTunes agreement I printed out. The report is actually right back here. A whopping 68 pages. That's right. 2.5 years, 68 pages. Lots of pictures, by the way. Just tons of pictures in here. Not a great deal of data in here, but a lot of pictures. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the time to go ahead and break it down and talk about it because, again, I've been waiting 2.5 years for that. And if you don't think I'm going to take some time and go through this, you're nuts. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, hang on. This is going to be a good ride. So this is the report, and I'm going to break this down into several areas. So the very first thing I want to do is go through the executive summary. So to give you the kind of quick, synopsis of what their major findings are. Then I want to break it down the way they do it in the report, including a step-by-step of what happened up on the bridge during the grounding of Ever Given, because there's a lot of questions and issues. And then I want to go into what the report determined to be the root cause of the grounding, and then the recommendations in the report. So let's take you back to early 2021. What a magical time that was, early 2021. Remember, we just had the first one-term president voted out of office since George H.W. Bush, and we've had a group of whimsical kids go to the Capitol building to watch the confirmation of the new president, and then we had the oldest president ever in the history of the United States take office. So there was a lot of things going on in early 2021, but then we had the magical moment that was Ever Given going ashore in the Suez, and what a great time that was. The memes, the digger. I mean, it was a great time. I mean, shoot, it's my image right here. It's the image of that I use all the time, and in many ways, this was the thing we needed to get our mind off everything else. And for 6 days, it really was a public issue, but the impact was great, as they note here in the beginning of the report. By 25 March, 2 days into the event, 230 ships were in the queue waiting to get through the Suez. And by 29 March, when they eventually remove it, 429 vessels are waiting to get out. And that is a major portion of global shipping right there. So there's a couple of parts of the transit into the Suez Canal. The first part where they up anchored and head into the canal. They embarked 2 pilots at 7:16 in the morning local time, and they completed the handover at 7:20. There's actually a series of pilots on board a Suez Canal transit. So the 2 pilots came on board, with one providing orders and one observing and monitoring. But as you'll find out, there were conflicting differences between the two. At around the time the pilots changed over, wind speed increased and visibility was severely reduced, and the pilots had difficulty maintaining position in the center of the channel. Pilots ordered full speed ahead to increase speed to assist in steering. So the faster a ship goes, the more maneuverable it gets. And in this case, the ship proceeded up to a speed of 12 knots. However, the recommended speed through the Suez Canal is just under 9 knots. And understand, a 400-meter ship, 1,300 feet long, barreling at about 12 knots, is a lot of ship, especially in a Suez Canal that can barely contain a vessel of that size. So with the increase of the wind, the pilot, and pilots are advisors to the masters. Pilots come on board to assist the ship's captain or master in piloting the vessel. And while the master is ultimately responsible for the safe navigation of the ship, the pilot has the expertise, the local expertise. But what the pilot lacks many times is knowing the handling characteristics of the vessel. And so there has to be a very symbiotic relationship between the pilot and the master. As the report says here, and highlighted and underlined in bold, is this. After the wind had increased, the pilot was issuing helm orders to the helmsman. Now, the helmsman is the person steering the ship. And believe it or not, you actually have someone standing there steering the ship, either with a wheel or more likely a joystick to control the rudder orders. These were either for hard to port or hard to starboard with no midships or lesser helm orders in between. So we're going to break this down in a little bit later. But what you have is the pilot telling the helmsman, throw the wheel one way, throw the wheel the other way. He is not telling, and I know it's a he, the pilot, he is not telling the helmsman to steady up on a course. Instead, what they're doing is basically snaking through the channel, and that is a recipe for disaster. It goes on here, about 7:38 hours local time, helmsman reported the vessel had stopped turning to port and started turning to starboard. At that time, the vessel was close to the port bank. Port is the left side of the vessel, one looking forward. And speed had increased to about 13 knots over ground, which is flying in a narrow channel. Then started to turn quickly to starboard away from the port bank. The pilot initially ordered the rudder to port 20 degrees and then hard to port. Hard to port is all the way over, to stop the vessel from turning. Then the second pilot started communicating with the first pilot in the local language. So the language you speak on board ship is English, but you have Egyptian pilots and Indian crew members. And so obviously you have a bit of a language issue here. And when the pilot starts speaking Arabic, you lose all kind of what's going on here. The first pilot reduced speed to half ahead, and the vessel continued to turn to starboard. Understand, when you take power off the vessel, you're going to slow down, but that takes time. But you also lose maneuverability of the water going past the rudder. There was another communication between the two pilots in Arabic, and the main engine was increased to full ahead again. So you're basically throwing this vessel half ahead, full ahead. You're going back and forth here. The vessel continued to turn to starboard. This is toward the right bank. Towards the starboard canal bank. The pilot again ordered hard to port, presumably to try to steady the heading, but the vessel continued turning to starboard. The main engine revolutions were increased to navigation full ahead. Now, this is not full ahead out in the ocean. This is their navigation full ahead at 53 RPMs. But still, the vessel was swinging heavily to starboard. The vessel continued this swing and grounded at a speed about 12 knots over ground on the eastern bank of the canal. So I'm going to have a link to the full report, and you can download it. Again, it's not tremendous, so it's easy to download. But I want to show you here from the objectives page of what they were setting out to do. So the main objective of this report was to, one, appreciate the importance of intervention in hazardous situations, two, identify the causes that led to the incident, three, understand how to prevent such incidences from reoccurring. And then it goes on here and gives you kind of the breakdown of how they're going to do it. So the present report is configured as follows. One, general description of the crew, vessel and crew. And so they go in some detail about all the details about the specifics of Ever Given and the size of the crew. General description of the voyage and environmental conditions, which is going to be key. General description of the casualty, what exactly happens. And then a series that we're really going to focus on here is the analysis, the conclusions, and the recommendations. So this is the description of the vessel, going into all the details you want. I'm not going to do it here. You can reference it. Just suffice it to say that, number one, this ship built in Japan with a Japanese owner, under charter to Evergreen, a Taiwanese company, with an American classification agency, the American Bureau of Shipping, under Panamanian registry with an Indian crew on board, with Japanese and English insurance, is a classic commercial vessel mess. It just is. This is a remarkably big vessel. We're talking over 200,000 tons here. Fairly new vessel at the time, built in 2018. Just huge vessel that is really pushing the limits of the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal. One of the things you'll note here is the vessel is just under 400 meters of length. That's because 400 meters is the acceptable length you can be to go into the Suez Canal. So vessels will be just under 400 meters. This is the details of the voyage. The ship had sailed from Malaysia and was heading to eventually Rotterdam via the Suez Canal. So it sailed on March 13th from Malaysia, arrived at the Suez Canal on March 23rd, and was due up to Rotterdam and eventually over to Felixstowe and then over to Hamburg. The estimated speed was about 18 knots, carrying about 167,000 measurement tons of cargo. So quite a load on board Ever Given. She was pretty well loaded down. Remember, this is the height of supply chain crisis, so goods are flowing like crazy out of Asia to Europe and the United States. So really important element here is the weather conditions, because weather was a factor here because we experienced high winds and, more importantly, shifting high winds. And we're going to see that play out here. So the wind direction was southerly with a wind speed of 25 to 27 knots with gusts up to 40 knots. So a southerly means it's coming from behind you. So it's actually pushing the ship along. But the problem is this thing doesn't stay southerly. It keeps veering and moving off. And so you're having wind impacting the side of the vessel. You're seeing the sea direction is southerly, although you don't have much current or any tide, really too much at all in the Suez Canal. The Beaufort scale is about a 6. Visibility is over 5 miles, but you'll have periods of low visibility due to sand. Okay, this is kind of key right here. This is from the rules of navigation for the Suez Canal. Now, there's a section on this you can take a look at, but I wanted to come here because I think this is the major ones to look at. So when you go through the Suez Canal, you do it in a series of what's called convoys. There's a southbound convoy and a northbound convoy. In the case of Ever Given, this vessel is in the northbound convoy. It's actually ship number 5 in the northbound convoy. It's supposed to be number 3, but somehow there was confusion and they got in as number 5 behind Costco Galaxy and ahead of Maersk Denver. And that convoy starts off at 0400 local time. They will start heading north. And they have a rendezvous point and the limited time of arrival. Now, under the rules of the Suez Canal, pilotage is compulsory for all vessels, whatever is their tonnage when entering, leaving, moving, changing berth, or shifting on canal waters at Port Said or Suez Canal. Permissible speed shall be as follows: 8.64 knots for ordinary vessels, 7.56 knots for tankers. Again, at one point, Ever Given was doing over 13 knots in the channel. It was doing 12 knots when it ran into Asia. Article 58, escorting tugs. The escort of VLCCs, very large crude carriers, ULCCs, ultra-large crude carriers, LPGs, LNGs, liquefied petroleum or natural gas carriers, large bulk carriers, and other vessels, except container ships less than 1,700 tons Suez Canal net tonnage. The Suez Canal is a very unique way to measure tonnage. Will be as follows. Important point is number 10. Container ships 170,000 Suez Canal net tonnage and more will be escorted by 2 tugs. Neither Costco Galaxy, which was ahead of Ever Given, or Ever Given herself were escorted by tugs. There were no escorting tugs. It goes on here and talks about, according to the special tonnage certified for the Suez Canal, the Ever Given, the gross registered tons was 222,000 tons. Net registered tons is 208,000 tons. Therefore, according to Article 58 escorting tug regulations, the ship had to carry out the transit with 2 tugs to comply with the rules of the Suez Canal. Gee, that sounds kind of damning for the Suez Canal. So I'm going to read from part of the report while showing you an AIS version of what's going on now. This is in the anchorage south of the Suez Canal. So on 23 March at 0024 hours, in accordance with instructions received from port control, the weather at the time reported to be calm and light winds. The vessel anchored at anchorage E16. It goes on here. After anchoring, the master went down to address needs for quarantine agents and canal authorities to purchase vessel arrival. At about 2:30 hours local time, master heard sound of wind howling outside the vessel. The officer of the watch informed master that the wind is gusting up to 35 knots. The master proceeded to the bridge and noted the wind was from a southerly direction, and the anchor cable was stretched to maximum. Due to the above position, the master instructed the duty engineer to prepare engines, and bridge team was alerted accordingly. After the engines were available, master observed that the vessel had started to slowly drag anchor in a northerly position. Due to strong winds, hence he commenced heaving up the anchor while using engines and bow thruster to maintain position. That is what's going on right here, and I know that the image that is going to be portrayed here is not a great one. It is not intended by the vessel to draw a big phallic symbol in the ocean. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happens here, as you will see. But what's interesting to note is the ship is dragging anchor in the anchorage before ever getting into the Suez. And this is an indication of the high winds in the area, which should have been a big indicator for anybody before you head into the narrow canal. Listen, I'm getting blown around on the anchorage. What's going to happen to me when I'm in the canal? All right, let's let this go and let the whatever be drawn in the world's oceans here. At the time, the master observed on radar that the adjacent ship, the El Nazaria, and you see the El Nazaria coming in here from the bottom right there, a vessel in starboard was dragging her anchor. The master immediately contacted El Nazaria on VHF in order to inform them of the dangerous situation. The officer of the watch from El Nazaria replied that they were using engines to keep her in position when the vessel anchored away. The master informed port control that his vessel intended to proceed, and now you get the full phallic symbol here, proceed out of the Suez Canal, waiting area air anchorage to a safer location for anchor. To the master's request, port control instructed the vessel to hold position of the convoy was in progress for starting, and the pilot was on the way to the vessel. So you'll see this little blue boat here, the Moshab 2, I believe it is, or 3, going from ship to ship. This vessel is dropping off the first pilot that's going to board on board. You see it right here. This is at 3:48 UTC. That's 5:48 local time. The pilot is now on board, Ever Given, and the vessel is going to proceed toward the entrance of the Suez Canal, the southern entrance, get itself into line and proceed. And this is a ballet. This is, if you've never been through the Suez Canal, ships are kind of moving around in these circles, trying to avoid each other. It is a very difficult position to be. It's kind of almost like the start of a sailboat race where ships are trying to gain position. And now you see Ever Given heading up and heading toward the Suez Canal at this point, and the entrance in. You see the ships forming up. There goes Al Nazaria. There goes Costco Galaxy. And now in behind it comes Ever Given. This next video is produced by Made Smart Group. It's a fantastic video that does a series of things. Number one, you have the 3D simulation here of Ever Given going into the Suez. You have a 2D chart simulation up here of Ever Given, and then you have the speed of the vessel as it goes through the passage. And so what I want to do is read from the report and sync it with what is going on in the video here, so you'll know exactly where we're at. So I've increased the speed here, about double speed, just to get us through this point. This is Ever Given coming into the southern approach to the Suez Canal. Now, at 7:16 local time, we're showing right now about 7:06, they will be boarded by another pilot boat. This is going to bring on board 2 pilots. The pilot from the anchorage will get off at this point, and these 2 pilots will take over for the southern leg as the vessel comes in. This is standard. This happens all the time. But one of the things to note at the very beginning here is how the vessel is kind of tracking to the left side of the channel. It's not quite smack in the middle of the channel, and this is going to be a problem as from the beginning onward. 2 new pilots come on board. They're going to exchange over control of the vessel at 0:20, and that handover is done with the first pilot coming on board, giving the new pilots basically what's going on. One of the 2 pilots will be providing direct conning orders, and the other was observing and monitoring. The master was also monitoring the actions of the pilots throughout this time. And it's around this time that the pilot changeover took place that wind speed increased and visibility was severely reduced with sands for a couple of minutes. Master and pilots had difficulty maintaining position in the center of the channel. In order to correct position of the vessel and place her in the center of the channel, they order the speed increase. And what we see right here is the speed had gone up from 9 knots all the way up to 12 knots. Now, high speed isn't unusual. The 8.6 knot speed is recommended, but it isn't always followed. And while this is fast, it is not uncommon. But the thing that goes on here in the report notes, after the wind had increased, the pilot was issuing more helm orders to the helmsman. These orders in majority were either for hard to port or hard to starboard, limited midship or helm orders. The pilot did not give the helmsman a course to steer, only helm orders. As per the master's statement, on at least 2 occasions when the vessel was turning very quickly due to these hard over helm orders, the master intervened to order to rudder amidships to reduce the rate of the vessel turning. Usually what you would do is tell the helmsman steer this course, and the helmsman who knows the ship would use the appropriate amount of rudder. Instead, what you have here is the pilots basically throwing the rudders between hard left, hard right, and in between there to get the vessel under control. And what you see here is the vessel is kind of meandering through the channel as opposed to really being on a set course. At about 0736 hours, the vessel was positioned on the starboard side of the channel. You can note that right here as the vessel is hugging right up here along the starboard side of the channel. Still water, still a lot of good water here on the right side of the vessel. At about 7:37 hours, go ahead and let that run there for a second. The pilot ordered corrected rudder and started to turn back to port, again using large helm orders. And so here at 7:37, you see the vessel kind of careening across the channel at this time. Remember, this is a 400-meter long vessel. It is longer than the width of the channel. And the ship doesn't really seem to have good control of itself. One of the things you would start thinking about here is slowing this vessel down and trying to end the pendulation. But again, it doesn't happen. At about this same time, the first pilot stepped back to full ahead, about 38 RPMs. After the head had started to turn to port to the left, the pilot ordered the rudder hard to starboard, presumably to steady the vessel's head. But with reduced revolutions on the main engine, the vessel continued to turn to port. At the same time, the second pilot ordered for more speed. The first pilot then also ordered maximum speed. So you're going from half speed back up to maximum speed again. From the above pilot's orders, as well as from the VDR, this is the vessel data recorder analysis, especially translation of discussions between the two pilots, it can be concluded that the pilots had started to realize they could not control the vessel, and there was a risk of grounding. So this comes directly from the report, and it's a transcript from the VDR. The vessel data recorder also records audio in the bridge. So at 05:32 hours UTC, there's how much? 11. There. She is 10 and 15. No, 13. I think they're talking about speed at this point. 05:33. The ship is not going right, Ashraf. This is obviously one of the pilots talking. 05:35, we need to reduce the speed because the distance is shortened. The distance is shortened. And so what they want to do is slow down at this point. 5:36, better you give him a track, Ashraf. In other words, tell him what course to steer. Give him the course and reduce the speed. The distance is shortened. The distance is 1.7. What they're talking about is probably the distance between them and Costco Galaxy in front of them. I will sit. He means I will put the vessel in the middle of the channel and reduce speed. This way you be stuck with the one in front of you. So one person was going to monitor where the vessel was in front of them. The other one is focusing on where the vessel is in terms of the channel. 05:37, I increase the speed. Again, because they don't have control of the vessel, they're going to increase speed. 05:39, shouting. Give him the track now. Give him a course to steer. 05:40, give him the track to follow. 05:40, calling from help from the tug Muan. At that point, they are aground. All right, back to the report. At about 7:38 hours, the helmsman reported that the vessel had stopped turning to port and was starting to turn to starboard. And if you look at the way the vessel's laid up, that's good because they were heading right toward the coast of Africa. At this time, the vessel was close to the port bank of the channel, and the speed had increased to about 13 knots, 12.9 showing here. The vessel then started to turn quickly to starboard away from the port bank. The pilot initially ordered the rudder to port 20 degrees and then hard to port to stop the vessel from turning. So the vessel is kicking in that swing. Then the second pilot started shouting at the first pilot in local language. There appeared to be a disagreement between them. The first pilot reduced speed to half ahead at 07:39 and 55 seconds, and the vessel continued to turn to starboard. There was another discussion between the two pilots in local language, and the main engine was increased to full speed ahead. The vessel continued to turn to starboard toward the starboard canal bank. The pilot again ordered hard to port, presumably to try to steady the heading, but the vessel continued to starboard. The main engine revolutions were increased to full ahead. Vessel continued swinging and grounded at 12 knots over the eastern bank at 07:41 hours. On grounding, the pilot ordered full astern and then crash astern at 07:44. Neither orders had any effect. The master also ordered the bow thruster to be started after the grounding in the first effort to refloat the vessel. There's a very brief little section here on the salvage and refloating of the vessel. It doesn't really go into great detail. I will recommend, if you get a chance to get one, Smith Bocalis, the ones who did the salvage, have a book out on the salvage. Great, the salvage of the Ever Given. If you get a chance to get a copy of that, really recommend it. I was actually sent a copy by the guys at Smith Bocalis, so I appreciate that, and I will, of course, plug them for sending that over to me. The report also goes in some great detail breaking down the damage suffered by Ever Given. This is Ever Given in the dry dock in China, and this is the bulbous bow that is absolutely crunched into the bow of the vessel. And just put some size perspective here, little yellow things you see right there and little blue things, those are people. It's people standing up underneath it. It gives you an idea of the scale of the damage. They actually cut off the entire bow back aft to just behind the bow thrusters, and they had a new replacement bow already built, ready to go, and they were able to stick it on and get the vessel out in a 13-day shipyard. So this is one of the few places I've found a really good breakdown of all the damage, going through each of the major compartments, talking about this. Absolutely a real extensive amount of damage assessment was done, from the engine room to the double bottoms to the bow itself. And they really do a good detail analysis. Again, it's something I just had not seen done really anywhere else. I had gotten information about the damage and how it was being assessed, but nothing along the scale of this amount of detail. One of the questions raised at the time of the grounding was, what was the condition of the crew? Were they tired? Were they not being able to get relief? And so they did an assessment based on IMO, the International Maritime Organization, along with all the standard organizations out there, on what constitutes crew fatigue. And based on those parameters, they found that the crew was not experiencing fatigue at the time, which is a good indication. I mean, that was something that really needed to be assessed. And so they went through this, and therefore fatigue parameters cannot be considered a contributing factor. They also did drug and alcohol tests on board with the crew. And so they did an assessment of that. And one of the things they were able to do is, in view of the above, the influence of alcohol consumption is unlikely to be a contributing factor toward the grounding of MV Ever Given. I should note that they did this to the crew, but there wasn't any indication it was done with the pilots. However, you can assume Egyptian pilots probably drinking was not an issue. I joked a little bit about this report not having a lot of detail. A good chunk of this report are screen grabs from the vessel data recorder showing different moments during the transit. And so one of the things you get is all this type of data here where they're grabbing it. I wanted to use the video because I think the video is a better image for you than using these screen grabs, but they're all throughout the report. It's when you get to section 6.2 that you start getting into the theories. What is causing this accident to happen? And they look at 5 specific issues. They look at wind effect, they look at squat bank suction and bank cushion effects. They talk about navigation decisions by the pilots, the intervention of the bridge team, and then the pilot roles. So that first one, wind. One of the things you notice here is that wind direction. At 5:06, it's coming from 77 degrees. So this is basically an easterly wind, an northeasterly wind coming at you. And then what you see is the wind really starts shifting toward that southerly direction and increasing speed. And so they had that wind basically coming from behind them the entire time, either off the port quarter or the starboard quarter the entire time. And you could see it how it's shifting, so that every time the vessel would turn, it would get a kick on the stern from the wind and really want to kick the stern out a little bit more, amplifying the issues that the ship encountered as it was maneuvering. So one of the issues you get is squat effect. And as it's defined here, when a ship moves through shallow water, which is the Suez Canal, some of the water displaces, rushes under the vessel to rise again at the stern. This decreases the upward pressure on the hull, making the ship sink deeper in the water than normal and slowing the vessel. This is squat effect. So basically the ship stern begins to get lower to the bottom. Then you have what's called bank cushion. As the ship navigates in a narrow channel, the water between the bow and the nearer bank builds up a high pressure, resulting in the bow being pushed away from the riverbank. So as your bow gets closer to the shore, because water is funneling between the ship and the bank, there's a push off. At the same time, due to low pressure at the stern is sucked into the riverbank. So if you think about what's going on with Ever Given as it's going through the Suez, the stern wants to squat down. It wants to get basically down at the back. The bow wants to basically push off the bank. It's kind of being pushed off the bank while your stern wants to get sucked in. So you've got 3 movements going on. Add to it, you have high winds pushing your stern. So every time you kick your stern left or right, and it's broad, to the canal because the wind's coming from a southerly direction. It wants to push your stern out, and you're going faster. So this is a scenario of disaster that these pilots are setting up for themselves. So the section on pilots, again, has a lot of great information. So per the Suez Canal Authority, pilots are advisors, indicating the best possible way to the master so that the ship can safely navigate. In the case of Ever Given, it was noticed from the beginning of the canal transit, the actions and orders of the pilots were not the more appropriate and not in line with best marine practices. And what do they mean by that? Well, I'll give you a whole list here. Pilots did not take into consideration bad weather conditions, and consequently, they have not requested assistance from tugs. Speed of vessel was higher than recommended. Although they had tried to correct the vessel position based on the electronic chart playback system, it was seen that from the entrance to the canal, the vessel had deviated from its intended course, the swing effect. Basically, they were chasing after the center of the channel. In their effort to correct the vessel position, they increased speed, not taking into consideration the effect of squat, bank suction, and bank cushion. The pilots took decisions without any form of verification. Pilots conducted their pilotage without requesting assistance from the master, giving directly orders to the helmsman. In other words, use the master's expertise in knowing how his vessel would basically perform. Pilots did not conduct any kind of verification assessment of ship's position. The pilots did not realize the hazard of steer the ship off plan track and did not cooperate with the bridge team. There was a breakdown here in bridge resource management. Same time, there's criticism of the bridge team. The master and the bridge team must always monitor pilots' actions. It is recommended that the pilot and the captain should determine in a meeting prior to starting the channel navigation who will indicate the direct orders to the helmsman. Again, you don't have a lot of time to do that. You're already in the channel when you've picked up these pilots, so not a lot of time to do this. It is noted, the master and bridge team, the following. Although an adequate passage plan had been prepared and uploaded, the canal passing plan was not implemented. The ship was off course. Open and clear communication of risk between the bridge team members was missing. Although the captain intervened during the transit through the channel, these actions were not effective in preventing the stranding. That's pretty obvious. Presence of two pilots rather than one may have convinced the master that, after all, they had better control of the evolving situation. I don't think two pilots arguing at each other in Arabic would have given me a warm, fuzzy feeling that they know what they're doing. The captain is the general responsible for the safety of the ship, had to take command of the ship when navigation was out of control. Yes, but at that point, they were beyond in extremis and already careening out of control. Then you have this statement, which I think is really interesting. It's the fifth and last point here, the pilot's role. This is very often a contradiction regarding pilot's role and responsibility for the vessel when under pilotage. The pilot's role is that of his advisor. He should give essential advice about the maneuvering of the vessel and place his experience and practical knowledge of the canal at the master's disposal. However, as it says here, again, bold, underlined, as per Suez Canal rules, although pilotage is compulsory, the master always retains responsibility, which makes it sound to me like the Panama Maritime Authority is blaming the master here for this event. All right, last two parts of this. The first is the root cause analysis done by the Panama Maritime Authority on what caused this event, and then a series of recommendations that they made. I think each of them are really interesting, and this is where I get a little bit contradictory of what I'm trying to read from these people. All right, I just read the statement about the master is ultimately responsible. Let's go to the root cause analysis as they identify it. So, determining the navigation of the MV Ever Given in the Suez Canal on March 23rd, 2021, a series of events and factors influenced the grounding, and they summarize them here. So, what were the factors? So, 1, wind speed, wind direction, squat, bank suction, and bank cushioning effects were factors that influenced the development of loss of maneuverability and grounding. Indications of hard helm orders instead of giving a course of steer by the pilots. So again, those factors, all of them, should have been accounted for by the pilots. I mean, the pilots know the wind condition. They know bank and suction and cushion. They know all these things. They should have taken a 400-meter vessel through the Suez Canal before. These are not unusual ships to go through the Suez Canal. Costco Galaxy is right in front of them at the same dimensions. So it's not unusual for these vessels to go through. Yet, if they're not taking this into consideration, then why are they piloting this vessel and why are the ones chosen? When you look at the events here, communication in the Arabic language on the bridge between pilots made it difficult for the captain and the bridge team to understand the situation in the Suez Canal transit. Yeah, if somebody starts speaking a foreign language, I don't know what they're talking about. The master intervention in the orders given by the pilots to the helmsman were not effective in preventing the grounding. All right, still, everything I'm reading here is kind of contradictory to what they just said before, where it's master's responsibility. It sounds like everything here is on the pilot. And I should note that there's a statement in here that you'll see where the Suez Canal Authority basically did not provide much information in the development of this report. Basically, the Suez Canal Authority refused to speak to the Panama Maritime Authority to put this report together. So Panama had to base this off their discussion with the master, the ship's crew, and what other information they can glean from public records, largely the lawsuit that was filed against Ever Given by the Suez Canal Authority after the grounding. Pilots and masters had not properly evaluated bad weather conditions, especially strong winds and reduced visibility, as a risk condition for a very large container vessel with a large area exposed to the wind. So they're blaming vessel traffic, they're blaming the pilots, they're blaming the masters. Vessel did not implement relative preventive measures against bad weather conditions, specifically the use of escorting tugs. The non-use of tugboats in a restricted area to better control the maneuverability of the ship contributed to the grounding. Again, how often are those tugs really used? The pilots conducted the pilotage without requesting assistance from the master. Although the captain intervened in the orders given by the pilot, instructing the helmsman to keep the ship in the middle of the channel, they were not effective. Bridge team did not realize the vital importance of effective, efficient communication between the bridge crew and pilots. I think they did. I just think it wasn't there. Goes on, according to the Suez Canal regulations, the captain had command of the ship at all times, and the pilot or pilots only fulfill an advisory role. Yes, but a key advisory role. There is a premise here that you expect the pilots to have knowledge and capability when they arrive on board. If they're deficient in that, then the Suez Canal Authority is providing deficient pilots who don't understand bank suction, bank cushion, wind impact, squat, all those considerations. According to Suez Canal regulations, the permissible speed is 8.64 knots. Ever Given sailed at a higher speed that was ordered by the pilots, by the way. The squat and bank effect, the speed, and the changes in the direction of the wind and the hard helm orders directly influence loss of maneuverability. All right. I think this is not a very clear report on who they're blaming responsibility. They seem to have spread it all over the place. And they're covering their bases. They're blaming the vessel traffic separation scheme control. They're blaming the pilots. They're blaming the master. They're blaming everybody. And everybody has responsibility here. But culpably, again, I go back to the issue, while the master is ultimately responsible, and the master should have done something prior to intervene in these helm orders and speed orders, you expect these pilots to have capability. And it doesn't appear that they did. Finally, let's look at recommendations. So a series of recommendations are given to a group of to different groups here. So first, crew training. Company SMS sections for navigation, high-risk operations recommended that prior to any transit in the Suez Canal, the team leader should gather deck engine officers to demonstrate, explain the proper marine practices to enhance teamwork. All right, sounds very clear. Establish clear communication during pilotage, of course. Evaluate the pilot's actions. You didn't have a lot of time to evaluate these pilots' actions. They took over at 7:20, your ground at 7:41, 21 minutes later. Not a lot of time really to evaluate. Pay attention to the transit. I don't think the ship was not paying attention to the transit. And then finally, pay attention to turns and the vessel's position. Again, I think this is all pretty straightforward. To the company, they talk about this. The following preventive measures which are related to cause and contributing factors are recommended. Although it has been observed that the company implements sufficient training system, it will be responsible to embrace specific training courses, titles regarding transit of the Suez Canal. The company should be notified in order to notify their whole fleet about lessons learned, with an emphasis on the master's authority and responsibilities. I'm pretty sure Evergreen had a great discussion with all their masters, along with every other major shipping line that goes through the Suez Canal. The company should implement training, campaign seminars for the bridge team in order to highlight and explain the importance of squat calculations and bank effect. I think everybody knows this issue when it comes to ships 400 meters going through the Suez Canal. These were the recommendations to the Suez Canal Authority. As the marine industry tends to build larger vessels, training of Suez Canal pilots with respect to maneuvering of large-sized vessels, as well as the effective wind, especially the container vessels, should be considered as mandatory. 2, working language of Suez Canal pilots, especially when 2 pilots are on board, should be imposed to be English. Great. You don't want to have separate arguments going on. 3, taking into consideration frequency, similarity, and consequences of marine casualties, incidents in Suez Canal, the Suez Canal Authority should consider to implement a system of alert notices and lessons learned to vessels transit the canal. Not aware of any that has really been generated by Ever Given. 4, the Suez Canal Authority should consider as mandatory requirement prior a vessel transit Suez Canal risk assessment conducted from the vessel's bridge team to be reviewed and approved from canal pilots. I don't know when that's supposed to happen because the time frame by the time you arrive in the anchorage and the heading up the canal is so short and brief that this takes time, and I don't think anyone wants to lose time. 5, refreshment courses for Suez Canal pilots with respect to squat, bank suction, bank cushion effects on different types of ships that transit the Suez Canal, as well as canal characteristics, should be considered to be conducted on a regular basis. 6, the Suez Canal should develop and implement contingency plan procedures, including details for tugboat assistance, and same should be shared with master and be included in Suez Canal transit risk assessment conducted from the bridge team. Again, where were the tugs in this? You have a requirement that ships have escorting tugs. There were no tugs with this vessel. Whose responsibility is that? Is it the ships or is it the Suez Canal Authority? The bollard pull of the tugboats available in the Suez Canal for salvage operations be appropriate according to the size of vessel. There's no way the Suez Canal Authority is going to have big enough tugs to pull off a vessel the size of Ever Given. You need massive salvage tugs in location to do this. And then finally, the Suez Canal should ensure that the latest Suez Canal regulations for navigation are published on their website, and obsolete documents should be removed. So, again, I think you see the blame being spread out here, but I think a lot of it goes on the Suez Canal Authority. Again, if you build a canal that can take a max-size vessel, they're going to come. If you build it, they will come. And that's exactly what's happened in the Suez Canal. They built a canal that was basically within the narrow tolerances of the vessels going through, and that was Ever Given. And Ever Given pushed the extremes here, and like they're being pushed every day. As I speak to you right now, there are ships the size of Ever Given going through the Suez Canal daily. But when you got into a position where wind and bank suction and bank cushion and squat and high speeds and pilots who don't know each other, what I would like if I'm the ship's master is the option to basically, not go in and out of the canal. But I also know that if I sit there and say, I'm not going to go through the canal today, that may cost me my job with my home company because I'm a day late arriving where I need to be. Or, I'm jeopardizing the schedule and that's going to cost money and therefore I'm going to lose my job. At the same time, if I request tugs, that's going to cost money and increase the cost of transit. If you're the Suez Canal Authority and pilots coming aboard, I'm a master. I'd love to see what ships have you piloted through the Suez Canal that look like mine. If I don't see a vessel like Ever Given you've ever piloted to, I'm going to be on big notice. I'm going to pay attention extremely well going through the narrow parts of the Suez Canal, which is basically almost all of it, except for the Great Bitter Lake. I'm going to be on attention. I want to see the manifest. Unfortunately, what tends to happen with Suez Canal pilots, it's the exchange of gifts. Yes, you give Suez Canal pilots gifts, and that tends to take a lot of time. It is not the proper handover of specifics in the navigation of the vessel. The report is, I joke about the length, the brevity of the report, but there is a lot of detail that's in there to take a look at. Not exactly sure why it took so long to do it, but anyway, it is what it is. Definitely a report that needs to be shared and looked at by anybody transiting the Suez Canal or any other narrow body of water. A lot of lessons here. Again, reliance on pilots is very easy for masters to do, but also gets you in danger. Again, look at Everforward coming out of Baltimore. We've seen this with groundings around the world where pilots are given the con of the vessel and they run into the dock, they run into cranes, they run into banks, they run into Asia in the case of Ever Given. You really need to measure that control. So 2.5 years waiting for this report. I got to admit, I'm kind of excited about it. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos. as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Very easy. You hit that super thanks button down below, and you can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon. Become a monthly, yearly subscriber to the channel. It allows me to keep this channel up and running and bring you the hard-hitting information you need about Ever Given running sideways in the Suez Canal. And have no fear, another ship accident, unfortunately, is probably right on the horizon. But in the meantime, we're going to be having our weekly What the Ship. I am not going to be talking about Barbie, Unclaws, and the 9-dash line. I want to make it perfectly clear. I'm not talking about that. I am resisting that to the nth degree of going down that conversation. Even though many of you are asking me for it, I'm going to resist it. But we're going to do our weekly What the Ship. And of course, we'll have features during the week on whatever maritime news really hits my fancy or requested by my Patreon members. Until our next episode, this is Al signing off.